such a treat to see so many familiar faces and dear friends. So thank you for gathering together and for making this opportunity possible. I also want to salute Ari for his extraordinary decades of service to the Jewish community. He's no longer just a servant of the Jewish community in Orange County. One of the silver linings of this pandemic we're going through is that we've all learned what chat room means, and we've all learned what Zooming means. And as a result, we can travel everywhere instantaneously without leaving our homes. And Ari has been so poised to be able to take one of the world's premier speaker series and class series and turn it into something really global. So you have a real treasure in your midst. And Ari, I just want to salute you for the work that you're doing. And then all I will say about my beloved life partner and friend, my Chavruta Eli Spitz, is that we have been good friends for a long, long time. And I pray that that will continue uninterrupted for many, many, many more years to come. So, okay, friends, here's what I want us to do tonight. We're going to do a three-part conversation. Next week, we're going to look at creation and how science and religion can integrate as partners. But to do that, I need to build a base with you tonight. And so tonight, what I want to do is share with you partly a personal journey and partly thoughts that shaped how I now move in the world and what my new mission has been. I also want to say I'm not very good at just talking. Some of you don't believe that, but it's really true. I normally like more interactive. So if there are questions or comments you want to make, do put them in the chat and I will try to respond to them in a reasonable way. But here's where I want us to start. When I was first ordained, and I had the blessing of being selected to go be the rabbi of this wonderful little congregation in Mission Viejo. And I, like many new rabbis, thought that if I just hustle enough and I smile enough and I teach enough and I preach enough, then everyone would become completely observant and that it was just a matter of time. And Wendy, I think I came pretty close, don't you think? But it turns out people have their own life histories and their own life stories, and we're all doing the best we can, and we're all juggling reality as best we can. But part of that was the notion that God was in control and that whatever happens, happens for the best. Religious people say those two things a lot. And I kind of tried to make that work and was working within that relatively traditional framework until year 5, when my kids were born. And in year 6 and 7, it became apparent that my son Jacob was starting to develop differently than many other kids. And that became more and more apparent. It became apparent in this preschool, it became apparent at services. And it turns out when he was a little under 3, he was diagnosed with autism. And it's a pretty serious autism. It's one that he has struggled with. And I just want to brag for a minute. Jacob is now 28, and he is doing so many things that the experts said he would never be able to achieve because he has this indomitable spirit and he just won't give in. And you may see him come in in a moment. He likes to visit and hear what I'm on Zoom. There he is. Hello, Jacob. But that created a real religious challenge for me. And the challenge was, here I am doing good deeds all the time, teaching people Torah, getting people to be observant. This kind of thing shouldn't happen to me. As if there's some insurance policy, as if, you know, the world is a morality play and your own commitment to Torah shields you from the realities of the universe. So I decided to take a break from God. I decided, and for about 1.5 years, 2 years, I never mentioned God. Now, fortunately for me, I was the rabbi of a conservative synagogue. So if you want a job where you never have to talk about God, it turns out I had the perfect employment. I talked about Jewish holidays. I talked about Jewish values. I talked about Israel. I talked about whatever. I just never said anything about God. And in 2 years, nobody noticed. But all the time, I never stopped believing that there was a God there. And I kept working for how do I integrate what I know about my son, which is he's a wonderful, amazing person who's been unfairly burdened with challenges that no one should have to have. How do I reconcile that with our tradition that says there's a great big heart out in the world that created us? So I decided there were two possibilities. I could either go in for therapy, or I could get a doctorate and work on it that way. Now, the therapy part was impossible for me. My mother is a psychoanalyst, so that door has been closed for me. I know how the stew gets made, can't do that. So I started to do a doctoral thesis on really how does the universe work? And I started reading a whole lot of science, a lot of neurobiology, a lot of Darwinian evolution, a lot of cosmogony, that's how universes get created, all to try to pull together, how does this all work? And I remember the day that I stopped thinking there was a bully in the sky. I was actually in Jerusalem visiting, and I looked up in the sky, and there was no longer this being that was in total control. There was instead just great love and compassion. And so I want to talk to you about the ideas around that transformation. Ready? So here's where we're going to go with that. Most people in most places of worship in the West, meaning in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim places of worship, are told that there are certain attributes of God that you have to believe in if you're going to believe in God. You have to believe that God is omnipotent. That means all-powerful. You have to believe that God is omniscient. That means knows everything. You have to believe that God is omnipresent. Don't need to tell you what that means. That God is eternal, which means that space and time don't pertain to God. And here's the kicker, that God is also all good. So all-knowing, all-powerful, ever-present, all good, and outside of space and time. And the challenge here is that three of those things are in conflict with each other. All good, all-knowing, all-powerful, right? So let me break this down, and then I'm going to move into a solution. So God's being all-powerful. There's a huge difference between all-powerful and very powerful. The gap between them is infinite. All-powerful means there's nothing God can't achieve, nothing God cannot do. Now, here's a problem with all-powerful. By itself, it's impossible, right? Even not dealing with it's conflicting with the other omnis, right? I'll give you one of my favorite examples of how this is a nonsense idea. Here's something that Brad Artson can do that an all-powerful God can't. Is it possible for Brad Artson to make a weight so heavy that he can't lift it? The answer is yes, it's actually regrettably easy to be able to do that, right? How about an all-powerful God? Can an all-powerful God make a weight so heavy that God can't lift? Well, no, in both directions. If God makes a weight that God can't lift, then God isn't all-powerful. If God can't make the weight that God can't lift, then God isn't all-powerful. It turns out this ancient game is 1,500 years old, right? The philosophers came up with the notion of all-powerful. It wasn't the Bible and it wasn't the rabbis. But we've been reading the Bible through the eyes of Greek philosophy, right? And so we believe that we have to think that God is all-powerful too, when in fact, There's no way to say all-powerful in biblical Hebrew. There's no word or words for all-powerful in Talmudic Aramaic. It's not a Jewish concept. It's a Greek concept. It comes from Aristotle, right? Aristotle needed God to be all-powerful because he needed to explain who launched the universe in motion. And he reasoned that if it was launched in motion, that's because someone set it in motion. And so if you go cause and effect backwards, you end up having to start with something so powerful that it moved everything ever after. All powerful. He also reasoned that because everything is cause and effect, that the only way for God to be the one who starts everything is if God isn't caused. That is to say, God can't be in motion. God cannot be dynamic. That's what eternal means. That means unchanging, not within time. So God has to be unmoving. Why? Because if everything that moves was caused by something before it, then if God is moving, the question becomes, what caused God to move? So there has to be at the beginning of it an unmoved mover to explain all subsequent motion. Last category I want to debunk for you is all-knowing. All-knowing doesn't mean very smart. Jews get really dicey when I start to criticize God's intellect. I'm not saying God isn't very smart. I'm just saying that all-knowing means there's nothing God doesn't know. But the Bible is full of examples of things God doesn't know. So just to remind you of a couple, God wanders through the Garden of Eden in the heat of the day, calling out, Ayeka, where are you, when Adam and Eve are hiding? That doesn't sound very all-knowing, does it? God repents of having created humanity in the time of Noah because God says with some shock and horror, these creatures are evil from their birth on, right? What, you didn't know that? So there's lots of times where God seems to be not all-knowing. But here's the biggest challenge. You can have a God, it's logically coherent to imagine a God who is all-knowing, all-powerful, if you're willing to say that God isn't all good. But you can't say all three at once. So Rabbi Spitz referred to the Shoah, to the Holocaust. You can imagine that God knew it was coming and that God had the power to stop it. But if someone knew it was coming and could have stopped it and didn't, there's no way you can describe that being as good. No way. Or you could say, well, God knew about it and God wanted to stop it, but God couldn't stop it. That's logical too. But what you can't have is all three. Impossible. Now, it turns out the two that you can't say in biblical Hebrew is all-powerful and all-knowing, because both of those ideas are alien to the Bible and alien to the Talmud. They are Greek ideas. What you can say in Hebrew in lots of ways, apologies to Michael Kafter, who wants to say all good, no, is you can say God is all good. Ki leolam chasto. And God creates the world and God says ki tov, ki tov. This is good, this is good. Ki tov me'od, this is very good. Right? God's goodness is praised throughout the Psalms, right? When I talked to my friend and teacher, Rabbi Harold Kushner, about this issue, he said, when did we decide that power was the supreme virtue, right? It's God's goodness that Jews have always worshiped. It's God's goodness that Jews have always wrapped themselves around, not God's power. So let's take that seriously. Let's imagine not an up there, out there God who is unchanging, in total control, all good, all powerful, because that's the main reason most people say they don't believe in God at all. If I have to say that everything that happens is exactly the way God wants it, then I'm out of here. For me personally, for me to say that God is all powerful and all good is to betray my son. I can't do that. If you make me choose, I won't do that. But I don't think we have to do that, right? So Ray Adorn talks about if God created everything, God created evil as well as good. That is an argument that's found within the Bible. Let's save that for next week. When we talk about creation, we're going to have a lot to say about that very subject. For now, I just want to lay the groundwork. So let's imagine a very different universe and a very different way of talking about God. Instead of imagining the universe in Newtonian terms, right? Isaac Newton is the one who told us that there's absolute time, absolute space, and that matter interacts like billiard balls. It bangs into each other on the outside. In that model, the most important power is coercive power. Who gets banged out of the way, right? And it's the interaction of solid substances. That's how things happen. But we know that, in fact, those Newtonian certitudes are false. That is to say, absolute time is a delusion that is harbored by our size and velocity. If we were much, much, much smaller, quantum size, or much, much, much bigger, galaxy size, we would realize that time is relative to the viewer, that we all see time from our framework. That's what relativity theory teaches. That's also, by the way, true of space, that space is not absolute. It is measured relative to the perspective of the viewer. If everything is relative, and here I want to say what's obvious in English, relative means you have relatives. It means you're not absolute on your own. It means your identity is in formation with the things you relate to. That's the key characteristic of the universe we are all in right now. All of matter is in shimmering interaction with everything else. So in that kind of a universe, it's not that things bump into each other from the outside, it's that everything responds with its own interiority in response to everything else. You make choices, you put them out in the world responds by its own choices. So we are constantly interacting and we are constantly influencing each other, and so is God. So let me give you an example of how I understand God to work in the world, because I don't believe in the God up there, out there, who's issuing citations and penalizing people. I don't believe in a God who breaks natural law or who can break natural law. Here's what I do believe in. About 10 years ago, I bought a new car. Cars have changed a lot in the last couple decades. The one I want to highlight for you is that the new car that I had has a woman who lives right under the dashboard, right under the map. And if you tell her where you want to go, she will tell you the most efficient way to get to your destination. Two things I need to highlight here. You get to pick the destination, and she only makes suggestions. Okay? But she's really smart. She's not all-knowing, but she is very smart. So you tell her your goal, and she tells you how to get there. Now, here's the problem with that. I'm driving in my car. I tell Glynis, I think her accent is slightly South African, so that's what I call her. I say, Glynis, here's where I want to go. She tells me how she thinks I should go. She says, at the corner, take a right. And I would have, except I had a really frustrating work day, and I was thinking about stuff in the office I forgot to turn. Or car pulls up next to me, and the driver is holding a cup of coffee while driving, while doing her eyelashes. And I'm so amazed at her multitasking skill. This is, by the way, why women should run the world, not men, right? I'm watching her, I forget to turn. Or, and Glynis does this sometimes, she doesn't care that I have to run through a part of Wilshire that has no light. So the fact that I'm going to have to drive through and get killed, she's indifferent to that, right? But for whatever reason, Glynis tells me turn right, and I choose not to do that. Here's the key. Does Glynis at that moment say, that's it, you have failed to heed my instructions, and therefore you are doomed to drive on the 405 forever? No. That's how most people think about God. That's what they see as God's interaction. The dominant God says, you didn't do my mitzvahs, you're going to burn in hell. What does Glynis say? Glynis says, recalculating. I think that's exactly what God does with us too. I think we have from God an intuitive sense of what the optimal next step is in our life. And I want to tell you what I mean by optimal. I mean optimal in terms of love, in terms of justice, in terms of compassion, in terms of experience. These four things are absolute, but there's lots of ways to package them. So I think God plants in each of us an intuitive sense of what that next choice optimally is to maximize love and experience and relationship and compassion. And then it's up to us. We decide if we want to follow. That's called the lure, L-U-R-E, in process thought. We know what the lure is intuitively. We decide whether we're going to follow it or not. And then when we don't, what does God say? Not, that's it, you're damned. God says, recalculating, which means your goal is still the goal. How you've come is a permanent part of your journey. You can't change the past. That God does know absolutely. But the future is open, and the future is multiple. God holds the potential of all possible futures. And God feeds us as a lure the optimal one for us, which means it's always personal, by the way. Right? No two people have the same lure at the same moment, because what's the next thing you should be doing in your life to flourish and thrive is not the same thing that the person sitting next to you should be doing at this same moment. We each have our own personal lure, and God meets us all in that lure. If I can give you a different example, it's not that God descends from on high. God was never gone. We are marinating in God. The universe is marinating in the divine. The Zohar, great book of Jewish mysticism that Rabbi Spitz and I read page by page by page over 5.5 years. The Zohar says that it's like honey cake in a vat of honey. From the perspective of the honey cake, there's honey and cake and honey. But from the perspective of the honey, there's just honey all the way through. So it is with us. From God's perspective, it's all a manifestation of divine. We perceive difference. We perceive distinctiveness, right? But God is always right there, not able to break natural law, because having created us, God created each of us with our own interiority, our own legitimacy. Any of you who have raised children or grandchildren know that they have their own opinions. Try as you might. They come with their own views, and they're going to find their own integrity. So what you can do as a parent is you can help show them how to make good choices. And then you have to stand back and let them make their choices. Right? That's true for God and creation. Everything in the universe, interacting with everything else in the universe, is always in the process of being presented with a lure. And that lure is the choice that will allow us to thrive best. And God is always there, always with us, and always hoping to help lure the universe from chaos to cosmos. Right? So how does that work? I'll give you, for instance, from my own life. When I was a 16-year-old in high school, got a driver's license. I loved having a driver's license. It was a good thing. And my mother would fairly regularly turn to me on a Friday afternoon and say, Brad, I don't know what plans you have tonight, but I want you to go visit your grandmother. Now you can imagine how a 16-year-old young man feels about that. And so I would start to put up a fight. I don't want to. I've made arrangements with my friends. I have plans. Why are you ruining my life? All the kinds of things that teenagers say to parents. And here's where my mother practiced process thought without even knowing it. If she had said to me, you have to go because I'm your mother and I'm telling you, I would have kept fighting. But she said something far nastier than that. She said, you do what you want. I know you'll make the right choice. Which to this day I hate, right? Because she's exactly right. Once you took authority out of the equation, of course I was going to make the right choice. Not only would I make the right choice, I would drive down and see my grandmother and I would feel thrilled. I adore that grandmother to this day, right? I'm so glad for every moment I had with her. But my mother was wise enough to know that the right decision is already within, so long as you don't smother it with a layer of authority and guilt that makes us deaf to what we already know. Process thought says that's how God works. God isn't a bunch of rigid rules. God isn't an endless source of guilt. God isn't the cop in the sky handing out tickets and putting us in prison. God is our great cosmic companion. And God works in, with, and through all of nature to help maximize the universe's ability to be a universe, to be a cosmos. Now that has certain big implications for us, which I need to get to, and then I want to leave time for us to talk. It means, among other things, that the kinds of things Jewish denominations have beat each other over the head with for the last 150 years are no longer that important. The primary fault line between conservative, Orthodox, Reform, and to some extent even Reconstructionism is, did God or did God not verbally dictate a book? So if you say, yes, God verbally dictated a book, then you're Orthodox. And if you say, no, we did it ourselves, then you're Reform. And if you're mushy on the subject, you're conservative. Welcome, right? But here's the thing, if I don't believe in an up there, out there God, then I don't think a book dropped from the sky. I think that the way God gives a book to us is to have it bubble up from within. I think that our ancestors were such people that they listened with their inner ear and they discerned the lure, maximizing love and justice and experience and friendship. They listened and then they translated that into words. Beautiful words, lyrical words, words that were stories, words that were guidelines, words that were prohibitions, but they had an active role in transforming Torah into a book. That, by the way, is also found in the Zohar. The Zohar teaches that there's a cosmic Torah that is bigger than the Torah we have, and that the one we have had to contract in order to be able to enter into a material world. So that our Torah, well, so Martin, I want to be complicated here. I want to say written by man, but God inspired, is still a God up there, out there. So people are made out of matter. The fact that the universe is full of mindfulness, full of consciousness, there is no universe separate from or outside of God. And God doesn't work separate from or outside of nature. So Torah bubbles up. It emerges through us. It's us and God writing it together. Rabbi, is the Torah divine? Yes, 100%. Rabbi, is the Torah human? Yes, 100%. How is it possible for it to be both? Well, if you think of a God as radically separate from the universe, it's not possible. But if you know that you are swimming in God right now, then every worthy thing you've ever done has been an upwelling of the divine. everything. Let me tell you two other things. If that's true, there's no up there, out there controller running everything in a literal way. But notice I also said there's nothing that isn't a manifestation of God. Every time you listen to the lure, and not just you, every time your puppy dog listens to the lure, and yes, they are lured also. Every time the insects in your backyard, and yes, they are lured too. Every time a plant rises towards the sun, it's following the lure. Everything in the universe is lured at its own appropriate level. And mindfulness is baked into nature at its core. We're going to talk a lot about that next week, right? But if that's true, then what do we mean by commandments? Well, here's another place where the old denominational divide is going to break, right? I don't believe in a God up there, out there, who drops a book on our heads and then hands out citations for infractions. I don't. I also don't believe that we came up with all of this separate from the universe we live in and that the Bible is purely a human projection. I don't believe that either. I think that the divine is always welling up in our hearts, and we're always putting it to words, setting it to music, setting it to poetry, creating paintings. We're living our lives as a tapestry of the manifestation of the divine. And I think that's what the commandments are. The commandments are really good advice. Here's a pathway that's been tested and honed by our people and our ancestors that is second to none for creating compassionate human beings and communities of justice. But it takes activity on our part to live it the right way, to be able to let it be. It can harden. You can follow all the mitzvot and think you're following the will of a king, an edict of a king, and you can use the commandments to make you a truly judgmental, wicked person, right? By the way, I just want to be clear in fairness to the other side. You can also jettison the Torah and follow none of the mitzvot and still be a wicked and an evil person too. It turns out the human capacity to do that transcends any ideological limitations, right? But if you're looking for a network of stories big enough to locate your life, and you're looking for a series of practices that builds loving community and allows you to address the inner challenges and to right them, there's no system that has been time-tested like Torah, like mitzvot. So here's how I think the Torah is a commandment. My kids I mentioned are now 28. My daughter Shira has had the capacity, many of you knew her as a very little girl, and some of you have even seen what I'm about to describe. Shira comes up to me and she says, "Abba, I want this." And there's a piece of me that just melts. It just melts. So when she was a kid, it was toys, time, attention, I don't know what. When she was a teenager, it was car keys, my wallet, I don't know what. But to this day, if Shira phones me and says, "Daddy, I need something," the answer is always yes with a full heart, always, right? Because that's a real command, right? An order from the outside is one that the minute the power disappears, so does the order. The late Soviet Union, it should rest in peace, had a huge empire until its power collapsed. And then the day after there were no Soviet armies, there was no Soviet empire because it was purely based on fear, purely based on authority. But if you can build a relationship that's based on shared values, common aspirations, mutual support, well, that's, it turns out, what a real commandment is. The people who are commanders in my life are the ones I love, not the ones that I have to answer to. They're in a kind of a relationship of mutual utility, right? But Ilana, my wife, it's my life mission to try to make her happy, right? Because real commandments come from within and are not coercive. They are suggestive. They are invitational. They are the manifestation of relationship. And if we love God and God loves us, then that's going to be the most interior of commands. It's not about sinning by violating them. It's that God wants to help us follow the lure. And we want to please the one who gave us life and made this abundant planet to live on, gave us this glorious, beautiful heritage that makes our life so rich and gives us such resilience when life brings us challenges. Last thing, then what's prayer? If prayer isn't magic, which is what most people think it's supposed to be, and they even try from time to time, and then they're disappointed. You know, back in the day when I was what my mother likes to call a real rabbi, which is to say my Mission Viejo days, we used to have this ritual in Mission Viejo where most of the members of the synagogue would avoid me for 11 months out of the year. And then they would all flock back for 3 days a year. The 3 days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, reminded them of why they had kept their distance for the rest of the year. And that allowed them to repeat the previous pattern. So we had 3-day-a-year visitors who paid a very high membership fee for the honor of 3 days a year. I'm grateful, right? But if prayer isn't magic, if prayer doesn't get the rules broken on your behalf, then does that mean it's nothing? Worthless? We're just talking to ourselves? There are people who think that, but not me. Because remember how I talked about how the universe is made of shimmering, interactive patterns of energy? That all of us are connected to each other in relationship? And that God is the one who holds all of that together in a shimmering, living web? I think when we put energy out in the world, it has natural impacts, not supernatural. I think the universe responds to our energy, not always the way we want. Sometimes things are too far gone. Sometimes you can't shift the vector enough to change the outcome. But I think we are all connected spiritually. We are all connected emotionally. And that our praying serves a couple functions. The first is, it's a chance for us to reorder our own interiority, to remember who we want to be. When I was a kid, I used to go across the wall in the Presidio in San Francisco, and I would take a magnet and I would run it through the earth, and the iron filings would all line up. Some of you may have done that too. Right? Hello, Jacob. Right? Yes, but now I'm going to talk to these people, okay?
Good people.
Thank you. So you run your magnet through the earth, and all the iron filings line up. I think that's what prayer does to our heart. I think that when we spend time at prayer, we commune with ourselves and with God at our own deepest level, and that lines up the iron filings of our soul. It just reorders us. It helps us get rid of the distractions and the dross and the voices that try to convince us that we're unworthy or that we're not loved or whatever. They're gone. 2, I think prayer puts energy out in the world and makes it available to others. So when I pray, I do pray for the sick. And I say, God, I don't know what's the best thing for this person, but I want you to take my energy and use it to help them, however that is. And then it also reminds us of who we are meant to be, which is why we pray with a book in our hands. Because we have a script of our people that reminds us who we can be at our best. And when we make those words our own, then we emerge different. And the community emerges different. All right, I know I've said a lot. And I know I've said some things that are more shocking, some things that are less. I want to answer one of the comments here, or 2 of them if I can. So let me start with, okay. I'm going to start with Gail. How's your God different than the Reconstructionist view of God? So first of all, I'm very uninterested in how my view is different than so-and-so's view. I don't find that helpful. Clearly, Mordecai Kaplan and I are swimming in adjacent ponds. The big difference between me and I'm going to talk about Kaplan's Reconstructionism, because contemporary Reconstructionism is so diverse that I don't think there's a single thing anymore. But Kaplan's God, Kaplan was influenced by pragmatism. Pragmatism said that questions that don't have a practical answer aren't real questions. So how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? What difference does it make? If it doesn't make a difference, don't ask it. And because of that, they shut down all kinds of speculative thought. If it wasn't thinking about an actual thing, stop thinking about it. So Kaplan's God had to be impersonal because he couldn't be personal. Kaplan's God had to be forces within nature that make for human betterment. Why? That's a little arbitrary, but it just was, right? My God, you should hear, is deeply personal at the same time, because I think you can be personal and a force at the same time. I know that I am. I am now sitting in a chair. So to my chair, I'm a weight. And I'm talking to you. To you, I'm a teacher. And every time Jacob comes in saying, when the hell are you getting off this thing? I'm being an Abba. I can be all of those at once, so can God. There are aspects of relationship with God that are force-like. There are aspects of God that are personal-like, because again, I also believe, as does process thought, that mindfulness, consciousness, awareness is not simply the frosting on the top of dead matter. We believe that matter at the very core is the emergence of greater and greater mindfulness. And the reason the universe erupts in greater and greater mindfulness, and eventually self-consciousness, and eventually spirituality, is because it emerges out of mindfulness. And God is that mindfulness. So that makes it very different than the Reconstructionist Kaplanian view of God. Ellen wants to know, doesn't this imply that the universe has a teleology? That is to say, it has a purpose, that God has a will? Yup. I'm very big on teleology. Here's the challenge. We'll talk about this next week when we talk about science and religion. Right? Science is not allowed to comment on purpose. But just because science can't talk about something doesn't have to mean it's not real. It just means you can't use science to find out more about it. But there are a lot of important things in the world that you can't use science to find out more about. How you feel about someone you love, for example, you don't want to pursue that in biochemical terms. It will only cause trouble for you, right? So I do think that the mindfulness of God created a universe in order to multiply relationship, to multiply our connections, our ability to love and to receive love. By the way, the tradition says that too, that that's one of the reasons God created the universe, was to be able to be in covenant. So if that's true though, then it also means there's more than one way for the universe to unfold, and it means the outcome is not guaranteed. Right? So in the medieval period, thinking the universe had a purpose meant it was in the bag. You didn't have to sweat it. God's will would be done. I don't think that. I think that God needs us to be in the game. God needs our effort. God needs our work for there to be a shot at really having this universe be a cosmos, a harmonious, integrated set of relationships. And so we are truly, as our tradition says, shutafim, God's partners in the work of creation, right? In that sense, I think that process thought is a better way of thinking about Jewish sources than the dominant imagery of an up there, out there, omniscient God who's all powerful. That, I think, makes it impossible. So Sheila asks about, her son has autism as well, wants to know, have I responded to the platitude, God won't give you anything you cannot handle? So Sheila, I want to say to you and to everyone here, actually, I think God mostly gives me stuff I can't handle. You know, it's a whole lifetime of stuff I can't handle, and then I have to deal with it. So if that's your vision of God, then what I am is the cleanup crew. But I don't believe that. I think that God never gives up on any of us. And God is at every moment both luring us with the optimal vision of what's next and then empowering us to try to make the effort to make that real. My son has told me that that's what saved him, that knowing that God didn't inflict this on him, that God wasn't his enemy, God wasn't the one who tortured him with this. It's not balancing something from a past life, which someone told me once, or that Jacob was a saint in a previous life and only a tip of his soul came back into the universe this time. People say such stupid things, right? None of these people were members of Congregation Elot, I want to point out. Right? That I think what God does is not give up on Jacob, ever. And that gives Jacob a sense of the lure and gives Jacob a sense, and my job is to support that then, to help Jacob know he can do it. He can rise to the lure. So I'll close with this story. Years ago, the doctors told us that Jacob would never make it through school, that he couldn't. And what they hadn't counted on was three things. They hadn't counted on Ilana, who's from an Israeli family. Don't tell an Israeli they can't do something. That's just an invitation for them to run you over. Second, they did not count on Jacob's incredible spirit and deep resilience and love of learning. And three, they didn't count on a God who never gives up. So fast forward, and Jacob is at a high school graduation 5 years ago in a graduation gown, walking across the stage where they called his name. And I recorded it on my phone because I knew I would not be able to see. And like I was crying the whole time. I pointed the phone in the direction of the sound. Jacob walks across the stage when they call his name. He walks unaided. He takes his diploma with a smile so big it lit up all of Los Angeles. First thing he does is open the diploma to make sure they got his name right, which they did. And then he jumps off the stage and comes running over to me to hand me the diploma. And I said to him, Jacob, you and God have just pulled off a bigger miracle than splitting the sea, which I deeply believe. You can split the sea in a Hollywood movie lot. That's no big deal. But you get my son to do the day-to-day work of not giving up. You inspire his teachers and his aides to not give up. You inspire his mother to never back down. Only God can pull that off. And that's not God doing that despite us. That's God doing that with us, which is exactly the God I love and the one I want to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask one question, though, before we go, since we have 2 minutes? Even though it was a great ending, I'm sorry. But how does your vision of God fit within our Jewish text? Because when you open up our biblical text, that's not the God I see. I see hints of that God, but then I see a God of anger and a God of war and a God who punishes. I see everything that you said is not God, and that's really a very strong element of our tradition.
It is a really strong element of how our tradition has been misread across the ages. And here's what I will tell you by way of not answering your question. What you see is influenced by the spectacles you put on. So if you put on the dominant metaphysics of an all-powerful God actively working in a world to bend it to his will and we passively having to receive it, then you read the Bible that way. And if you read the Bible that way, and here another Zohar quote, the Zohar says that there are those who read the Bible as though it's literally true. And if that were true, we could write a better one. Right? That's the Zohar. It's exactly right. You're reading poetry as though it's prose. So when we get to the third class, not next week we're going to do how science and religion work together in this vision of religion. But the week after that, we're going to talk about revelation. So what is the role of God in our Torah, in our tradition? And why is it that a poor victim like Ari could be so misled across the ages that he reads the Hebrew Bible and sees God as vicious and angry and mean, which, by the way, is how many, many, many people misread the Bible, but it is a profound misreading.
Well, good. Now I have to wait 2 weeks to
That's a teaser to bring you all back.
I like the teaser. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Rabbi Artson, for staying up late for us.
My pleasure.
You know, it is late. It's almost 8:30 bedtime for California people. We have some New Yorkers. We've got David Silverman and we've got Lindy from New York. I don't know. And then we got Hugo Velasquez. So I know it's like a miracle. I mean, we have Hugo right there. I can see him. It's amazing. It's another miracle of CSP.
Yeah.
But I do want to thank all of you for coming out. I know many of you, some of you I don't know. Some of you are new donors to CSP. And many of you are big fans of Rabbi Artson, or now new big fans of Rabbi Artson. So we'll be back next week, same time, same CSP channel. Everyone keep safe and wear your mask. And, you know, you be very vigilant. This fall and winter are going to be very tough. So I want to see you on lots of CSP programs. Take care. Have a good night, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye, Rabbi Spitz. Thank you. Thank you, CBI, for co-sponsoring. Great program. Myra Weiss, thank you for joining us. Okay, everybody. Good night. Good night, everybody. Good night, Witzlings. Good night, Hugo. Sorry we can't camp this year. Bye, Susan Edelman. Bye, Gallons. Good to see you. Bye, Wendy Lupel.